Gere and Cindy Crawford. The love story that looked perfect from the outside. There are love stories that feel written by fate. And then there are love stories that look so perfect, so glamorous, so untouchable, that the world mistakes beauty for destiny. In the early 1990s, Gere and Cindy Crawford were that couple. He was the silver screen icon, mysterious, sophisticated, older, already carrying the quiet gravity of a man who had seen more of life than he would ever explain. After films like Pretty Woman, he had become one of Hollywood's most desired leading men. She was the face of a generation, one of the original supermodels, radiant, modern, magnetic, and seemingly born for the camera. Together, they did not just walk into a room. They changed the temperature of it. When Gere and Cindy Crawford appeared side by side, they looked less like a real couple and more like an idea of love the world wanted to believe in: elegance, beauty, fame, power, and mystery wrapped into a single image. But behind the photographs, behind the flashbulbs, behind the red carpets and the fashion headlines, there was another story unfolding, quieter, more human, and far more fragile. Because sometimes the couples who look the most perfect from a distance are the ones struggling the hardest to become real up close. This is the story of Gere and Cindy Crawford, a romance that defined a moment, fascinated the world, and proved that chemistry, beauty, and timing are not always the same thing. When two worlds collided. By the time Cindy Crawford met Gere, she was already becoming a global phenomenon. She was young, stunning, ambitious, and moving fast through a world that rewarded beauty but demanded reinvention. Richard, on the other hand, was older, already established, and living at a different emotional and spiritual rhythm. Reports and later interviews describe an age gap of about 17 years, with Crawford in her early 20s when they met and Gere already in his late 30s. From the outside, that age gap added intrigue. To the public, it made them even more fascinating. He seemed experienced and introspective. She seemed fresh, luminous, and full of possibility. It was the kind of pairing celebrity culture loves: opposites in tone, united by magnetism. And maybe that was part of the attraction. Gere was never simply a conventional Hollywood star. Even at the height of his fame, there was always something detached about him, something inward. He projected sex appeal, yes, but also reserve. He seemed like a man searching for meaning beyond applause. Cindy Crawford, meanwhile, represented a new kind of superstardom, glamorous but approachable, powerful yet still growing into her own voice. When they came together, the press saw a fairy tale. Hollywood royalty meets the queen of fashion. But real relationships do not live in headlines. They live in the private spaces between two people, in conversations, insecurities, silences, routines, and emotional timing. And that is where things are rarely as simple as they look. The couple everyone talked about. Very quickly, Gere and Cindy Crawford became one of the most photographed couples of their era. In the early 90s, there were few pairings more visually iconic. He had the polished, mature elegance of a classic movie star. She had the striking beauty that made magazine covers look historical the moment they were printed. Together, they were not just admired. They were mythologized. Every appearance mattered. Every red carpet became an event. Every photograph fed the idea that they were living some elevated, cinematic version of romance. The public did what the public always does with beautiful couples. It projected perfection onto them. But image can be both a gift and a burden. The more dazzling a couple appears, the less room the world gives them to be ordinary. They are expected to be effortlessly in love, endlessly compatible, permanently enchanted. Any sign of distance becomes gossip. Any silence becomes a theory. And in their case, gossip arrived early and often. Their relationship attracted intense tabloid attention. There was fascination, but there was also speculation, intrusion, and pressure. Years later, the story people will remember was not just that they were glamorous. It was that the world seemed obsessed with defining them before they had even fully defined themselves as a couple. That kind of attention can distort a relationship. It can make two people start performing for an image that has nothing to do with who they really are. And when that happens, love can start becoming something you are seen in instead of something you are truly living. A Vegas wedding and a beautiful illusion. In 1991, Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford got married in Las Vegas. It was fast, surprising, and instantly iconic, the kind of celebrity wedding that felt spontaneous enough to be romantic and glamorous enough to become legend. Crawford was in her mid-20s. Gere was in his early 40s. To many fans, it seemed like the natural next step in one of the most envied romances in the world. And yet, with hindsight, that wedding now feels almost symbolic. Because sometimes people do not marry at the height of clarity. They marry at the height of emotion, momentum, fantasy, and hope. Maybe they believe their connection would deepen with commitment. Maybe they thought love would become easier once it became official. Maybe they assumed that because their bond looked extraordinary, it would naturally grow into something stable. That is one of the most human mistakes in love. We think intensity guarantees endurance. We think attraction guarantees compatibility. We think choosing each other once means we will keep choosing each other in the same way forever. But marriage does not freeze a relationship in its most beautiful frame. It tests whether two people can build a life inside the frame once the cameras are gone. And that is where Richard and Cindy may have discovered the difference between being an unforgettable couple and being a sustainable one. Love in different life stages. Years after their divorce, Cindy Crawford spoke with unusual honesty about that period of her life. She said that when she was young in relationships, she was willing to shape herself around a person she loved, to take on their interests, their worldview, their identity. Reflecting on Richard Gere specifically, she suggested that she had, in some ways, molded herself around him. That kind of insight does not come from bitterness. It comes from growth. It also reveals something crucial about their marriage. They were not just two famous people with busy schedules. They were two people at very different stages of selfhood. Richard Gere already knew who he was. He had lived more, seen more, established more. He had a formed inner life, a spiritual seriousness, and a strong sense of direction. Crawford, though already massively successful, was still becoming herself. She was still young enough to be discovering where her own center was. That difference matters. Because when one person in a relationship is still becoming, and the other already is, the balance can shift without anyone intending harm. One person leads naturally. The other adapts naturally. And if that pattern continues too long, love can begin to feel less like a meeting of equals and more like a quiet disappearance of self. Crawford also later pointed to the age difference and the mismatch in priorities. In some interviews, she suggested that they simply were not in the same place in life. She was building a career. He was deeply committed to a more spiritual path and a different kind of rhythm. Both valid, both real, but not always aligned. This is what makes their story so compelling. It was not just a failure of romance. It was a collision between image and identity, between attraction and timing, between admiration and emotional readiness. And those are the kinds of conflicts that no amount of beauty can hide forever. The cost of distance. One of Cindy Crawford's most revealing reflections about the marriage was devastating in its simplicity. They did not spend enough time together. She later described the strain of trying to make a relationship work through constant movement, crossing cities and schedules just to share brief moments. It was not one dramatic betrayal that defined their ending. It was something more common, and in many ways more painful, disconnection by accumulation. That is how many love stories actually break. Not with a single explosion, but with small absences, with postponed conversations, with emotional fatigue, with a slow realization that wanting each other and truly living with each other are two different things. Fame made that worse. Their careers demanded travel, appearances, commitments, reinvention. Their relationship was being watched by millions while being lived in fragments. It is hard enough to protect intimacy in ordinary life. In celebrity life, it can become almost impossible. How do you build trust when time is scarce? How do you build partnership when your lives are moving in parallel instead of together? How do you stay emotionally present when the world only asks you to stay photogenic? These are not glamorous questions, but they are the questions every lasting relationship must answer. And perhaps Richard and Cindy, for all their chemistry, simply could not answer them in the same way. Why perfect couples sometimes don't last. This is where their story becomes bigger than celebrity. Because Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford were not just an iconic couple. They were an example of a truth most people learn eventually. Some relationships are meant to teach you who you are, not to stay forever. That does not make them fake. It does not make them meaningless. It does not make the love unreal. Sometimes a relationship is real precisely because it changes you. Crawford later described their marriage as a chapter in her life, and that may be the most mature way to understand it. Not every chapter is the whole book. Some chapters are there to wake you up. Some show you what attraction feels like. Some teach you what you must never lose in yourself again. Some prepare you for the love you will be able to build later when you know your own voice more clearly. That is part of what makes this story so poignant. To the world, they were a dream. To each other, they may have been a lesson. And there is no shame in that. Because one of the cruelest myths about love is that if it ends, it failed. But that is not always true. Sometimes love succeeds by revealing the truth. Sometimes it succeeds by ending before two people do more damage trying to force a future that does not fit them. Sometimes the bravest thing two people can do is admit that what brought them together is not enough to carry them forward. The end of the marriage. In 1995, after 4 years of marriage, Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford divorced. Publicly, the ending was treated as the fall of a glamour empire, another proof to the tabloids that famous love stories never last. But their later reflections suggest something more nuanced, not scandal, not melodrama, but incompatibility, distance, and different seasons of life. And maybe that is why their story still resonates. It is easy to understand betrayal. It is easy to understand chaos. But there is something especially heartbreaking about two people who do care, who do admire one another, and who still cannot make a life work. Years later, Crawford said they were friendly, though no longer close, almost like he had become Richard Gere again, more distant, more public, almost like a stranger from another chapter of life. That is such a haunting idea, that someone who once knew your private heart can, over time, return to being a figure the world recognizes more than you do. That may be one of the saddest things about lost love. Not that the person disappears, but that they remain in the world, carrying your memories, while no longer belonging to your daily life. What came after? After the divorce, both Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford went on to build new lives. Gere later married again and became a father. Crawford eventually found lasting love with Rand Gerber, whom she married in 1998, and together they built a family with their children, Presley and Kaya. In many profiles and later interviews, Crawford's long marriage to Gerber is described as rooted in friendship, mutual respect, and a more grounded partnership. And maybe that is another quiet truth hidden inside this old Hollywood romance. The love that dazzles the world is not always the love that steadies your life. Sometimes the grand love story teaches you what you desire, and the quieter one teaches you what you need. Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford may not have lasted, but they remained unforgettable because they captured something rare. The moment when two symbols of beauty and fame tried to turn fascination into partnership. And for a while, they almost convinced the whole world, and maybe even themselves, that they could. The couple, the myth, the memory. So what was Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford's love story, really? It was not just a celebrity marriage. It was not just a glamorous failure. It was not just a tabloid obsession. It was a story about timing, about identity, about the danger of becoming too small inside someone else's gravity, about how love can be real and still not be right forever. They were one of the most beautiful couples of the 1990s. That part is undeniable. The photographs still prove it. The elegance, the chemistry, the cinematic aura, it is all still there. But maybe the reason their story survives is not because they were perfect. Maybe it survives because they were human. Because behind all that glamour was something deeply recognizable. Two people trying to love each other while standing in different places in life. And that is the kind of story that never really grows old. Not because it ended happily, but because it ended honestly. And sometimes honesty is the final form of love. Richard Gere and Cindy Crawford gave the world an unforgettable image of romance. But in the end, their greatest legacy may be the truth they left behind. That love is not measured by how beautiful it looks in a photograph, but by whether two people can remain fully themselves inside it. And that is what makes their story unforgettable.